Creed Haymond, late Chief Counsel of the Southern Pacific, could hardly be called a dabbler in the occult or a believer in things supernatural, and yet his intimate friends remember he did believe implicitly that he had seen one ghost. It was early in the 50s when Haymond, then a stranger in California, became an express rider. He used to make regular trips into the mountains, visiting the camps at stated intervals, carrying in his bag saddle letters, papers, and such small articles as could be transported in this way. On one of his first trips, away up in the Sierras, he came to an almost deserted camp where a rich strike had been made and the pocket quickly exhausted. Only one family had remained, that of a man named Rodden. In a small, comfortable house close against the wall of rock which rose behind the camp, a light was burning as Haymond rode into the deserted place. A knock at the door brought forth the occupant. To Haymond's request for lodgings, the man growled a surly response and reluctantly let him in. The express rider was surprised to see sitting beside a little table, on which stood a lamp, a young and pretty woman. He was surprised to recognize in her a schoolmate whom he had supposed to be still in her eastern home. After their greetings had been said, Haymond explained to the ungracious husband how he had known Mrs. Rodden back east. Rodden grunted some response, but Haymond and the woman were too busy asking and answering questions to heed his manner. The man seemed relieved by Haymond's departure the next day. He told the express rider to call whenever he was passing over the trail, and the woman urged him to come again and stop for the night that they might talk about people and things at home. It was more than a month before he again came to the deserted camp, and this time, reaching it at an earlier hour, he found the woman alone, her husband having not yet returned from his work. Haymond learned from her that she had married Rodden against the wishes of her family, and had come to the mine with him without letting her parents know where she had gone. She said little about her life in the mountains, but that showed that it had not been a happy one. They had come to the camp with a number of others, but some quarrel had arisen between her husband and the rest of the miners, so when they were moved on, he had remained behind and, by hard work, was making fairly good pay in the deserted diggings. She dreaded the loneliness of the place, but with a patient sigh said she hoped before another winter her husband might be willing to move on to some camp where they would have company. Haymond made 2 trips more, calling each time at the cabin where his schoolmate lived. When leaving the second time, he told them that 1 trip more would be all he could make before the snow blocked the trail. 2 or 3 times Haymond suggested to Rodden that he would take his wife to some settlement before winter shut them in, but had received no answer. He did not feel at liberty to say more, so, with the promise to visit them on his return in a few weeks, he mounted his horse and rode down the narrow trail. A few steps took him out of sight of the cabin. He heard a faint call, and looking back, saw Mrs. Rodden running down the trail after him. She waved her hand for him to return, and he rode back. "Will you do an errand for me while you are in the city?" she asked. "Of course," he consented, and she gave him her commission, and with a few parting words, she ran up the trail while he turned his horse again to descend. He looked back after his young friend and, to his surprise, saw Rodden rise from behind a bush near the trail. He thought the man had been hidden, watching his wife, but a reflection made the idea seem absurd. Probably it was a mere coincidence. Even if Rawdon had heard every word of the conversation, it could only have spoiled Mrs. Rawdon's little plot, which was nothing worse than a Christmas surprise for her husband. Haymond was detained at work longer than he had expected, and when he started for the mountains again, his friends told him he would never get through, but he persisted. And finally, after a long battle with the snowdrifts, he reached the last camp on his route, having lost a week on the way. Dusk came while he was still more than a mile from the cabin. He pressed on as fast as he dared, when suddenly his horse stopped, short with a snort, and stood quivering. Haymond could see nothing, and soothing the animal with his hand and voice, urged him on. There was still light sufficient to see around clearly enough to distinguish objects near the trail. Haymond thought, as he started again, that he saw something move across the trail a little way ahead. The horse went slowly forward, but with great reluctance, and when they reached an open spot where the light was sufficient to show objects for some distance, he again stopped, trembling, and Haymond, for a moment, could not persuade him to start. At first the horse started forward with a bound, and as he did so, Haymond saw Maggie Rawdon on the trail, her hair hanging around her pale face, her hands stretched pleadingly towards him, and with an expression of mute agony upon her white face. Reining up as quickly as possible, Haymond turned to speak to her, but she had vanished. He rode back and called her name, but there was no answer. He dismounted and looked for tracks at the spot where she must have left the trail, but found none. Puzzled and annoyed, he mounted and rode as rapidly as possible to the Rawdon cabin. Hurriedly dismounting, Haymond called Rawdon out and asked him if he knew that his wife was wandering alone through the snow away up in the mountain trail. Rawdon was too much unnerved for a moment to reply. Then he managed to say that the express rider must have dreamed he saw her, as she had gone home, gone back east, more than a month before. Haymond stuck to his story, but at last he was obliged to conclude that his imagination had played him a trick. He couldn't help wondering, though, what had frightened the horse. After supper, Haymond opened his saddlebag, saying, "Well, as Maggie is not here to take her package, and as it was intended for you, anyway, I suppose I'd better give it to you, and you can write her that her Christmas present got a little ahead of time." He tossed the package across to the man, who stared at it as if petrified. He stretched out his hand slowly and opened it with shaking fingers. The package contained a pair of thick, warm gloves, nothing more. "When did Maggie send for these?" he asked. "The last time I was here, you came near not getting them at all, for she had no chance to tell me to buy them while I was here, and had to run after me to give the order." "Was that all she ran after you for?" "That was all." Rawdon settled back into his chair with a groan and hid his face in his hands. Haymond sat silent for a moment. Then, finding that the man did not intend to speak, he concluded that the best thing he could do was to go to bed. He was soon sleeping, and knew nothing more until morning light, shining through the uncurtained window, awoke him. He dressed hurriedly and went out into the room where he had left his host. It was silent and deserted. A glance into the side room showed that the bed was unoccupied, and Haymond went out to look after his horse, as well as to see if he could find any signs of his host. The horse had been stabled in a deserted cabin, and Haymond pushed open the door and then sprang back into the open air. Swinging by a halter from the rafter was Rawdon's dead body. Haymond cut the body down and laid it carefully in the bunk. He could do nothing for it, as the snow covered the frozen earth, so that one man could not hope to dig a grave. Hastily saddling his horse, he drove away, after searching the cabin in the faint hope that he might find some note of explanation, but in vain. Not a line of writing, new or old, could be found. Haymond stopped at the first settlement and gave notice of the suicide at the deserted camp. But the snow was falling, and no party could reach the place for weeks, if before spring. When he reached the city, he wrote a letter to his parents, asking them to break the sad news to the widowed Mrs. Rawdon. Weeks passed before he received any answer, and then he was astonished to learn that Maggie had never returned home. In fact, she had never even written since she left for California. By this time, spring had come, and he was about to make his trip to the mountains. He reached the town where he had given notice of the suicide in time to learn what had been discovered at the lonely cabin. A thorough search had been made, but nothing had been found to explain the suicide. Hidden away in one of the distant cabins, they found Mrs. Rawdon's clothing, her ornaments, even her work basket, and in fact, so far as they could judge, every article that belonged to her. Haymond told the men of the events of that last night and his interpretations of them, but he said nothing of his meeting with the wronged woman in the storm. That was Creed Haymond's one ghost story. Years passed before he could speak at all of that meeting in the storm and darkness, but till the day of his death, he believed that the spirit of murdered Mrs. Rawdon had appeared to him on the trail.